Hey, in this video I'd like to talk about the Microsoft Digital Defense Report 2022. It is a 100 plus page document that goes very deep into the threat intelligence that the many Microsoft cybersecurity teams with more than 8,000 people essentially in the many teams that Microsoft contains or has have contributed to. The findings spans from down specific threats and threat incidents that were found and recommendations to combat those threats, but also from a very holistic and overview perspective. It also looks at generic geopolitical threats that are somewhat related to cyber and that are impacting our overall well-being as a population as well. It is a very good look at everything that has happened from a cybersecurity perspective in 2002. Now let's jump into the report. So starting out from the report itself, or how can you access it? All you need to do is just look for Microsoft Digital Defense Report 2022. I'm going to be sharing this URL for you to just find it, but you can access the report right from here. Now you have executive summary, which you can just leverage to send that to key stakeholders in organizations or to just get key takeaways from the report. But if you want to dive really deep into the weeds of it, I recommend just going for the report itself. This is the report. It's public access, so everyone can access it. Once you get access to it, you're going to see here the contents, right? More than 100 pages here of in-depth look at very different domains or very different sections for cybersecurity within the timeline of July 2021 up to June 2022. So that is important to note, right? So from that specific timeline or time slot, that's where this touches on. Okay, now what different domains or what different sections does this include? First and foremost, the state of cybercrime. I'm going to be talking about each one of them following, but just an outline. State of cybercrime. So how cyber criminals and cyber attacks have evolved in this time span. Also, look at nation-state threats. So major activity for Microsoft cybersecurity is to combat nation-state threats, and that is because these are essentially threats that are the most advanced ones and that are oftentimes causing the biggest impact against enterprises and even to infrastructure, to cyber infrastructure. It also looks at devices and infrastructure, so how OTs are being, OT networks and IoT and supply chain are being affected by malicious actors. Then it looks at a very important topic here for cyber influence. So this topic to me was very interesting because it looks not only at cybersecurity from a technology perspective, but also from a people perspective. It's looking at cyber influence operations, right? We're gonna touch on this, but it's looking at cyber influence and how cybersecurity or cyber is being utilized to drive public opinion or to even drive propaganda across the world, or even topics that are top of mind for cybersecurity experts like you and I, which is synthetic media. What's the growth of that? What does that mean for cybersecurity in the coming years? And lastly, just looking at cyber resilience, because that's top of mind for all organizations currently, right? So what are the most seen threats for organizations? What is cyber resilience really? What does it mean to be connected currently? What does the remote work impact has been in the modernizing of systems and architecture? And of course, in this section, this is one of the most impactful ones if you're protecting your environment, which is essentially just looking at basic security posture. And what are the 5 key takeaways for basic security posture that can greatly enhance your security? Okay, so now let's jump into the state of cybercrime. So this here is one of the pages of the document. It is the first one, an overview of the state of cybercrime. Now, what's really pressing and important to understand is cybercrime continues to rise naturally, but also cybercrime as an economic and an industry itself. So, cybercrime as a service is one of the findings here from the report, and other vendors as well have reported on this, how they have found a lot of evidence of cybercrime as a service, to how it has grown over that same similar time period. Now, the modus operandi, or how attackers are performing their attacks, is changing a little. So, threat of ransomware and extortions becoming more audacious. Like you see reported here, attacks targeting governments, businesses, and critical infrastructure. There are a number of geopolitical things going on in the world that actually lead to this finding, as you can see and dive deep down into the report. But just think of what's going on within Europe, right? How that impacts critical infrastructure from a cybersecurity perspective, for example. Attackers are using a new method, essentially, right? Or they're modifying, improving their methods to not only impact devices in your network to just ransom your devices and block your access to your devices from that point onwards, but rather they're performing extraction of your data first and using that data that they already extracted and that is in their possession as a way to get you to pay a ransom to them. So the ransom tactics have changed from the traditional way of encrypting devices, which have been somewhat curbed and hindered by proper backup methods and good EDRs. So they've changing that to exfiltrating data first and then threatening and asking for ransom for that data that they already have in their possession. Microsoft's cybersecurity team has also created a new term, or coined a new term, for a specific ransom that is not just automated, but rather it actually has operations behind it, and they call it human operated ransomware, or HUMOR if you put it in a specific acronym. Now, this is the most impactful ransomware that has been noticed by their research, and it means that these are very advanced ransomware campaigns, right? And they have a high success rate. That's the biggest difference versus traditional automated ransomware campaigns. Now, these numbers here are a representation of what Microsoft Defender for Endpoint has seen in the wild, targeting specific organizations. From those organizations, they have seen very few number of them going further into this attack campaign, because malicious and adversaries are actually looking at all these possible organizations and understanding the financials to understand which ones of them could be more profitable from their perspective. And then they're launching their campaigns against a select few, and which ends up leading to very few infections, but ultimately with the biggest gains from their perspective. So they're utilizing a very different approach to just performing their attacks. Now, it also talks about how here the zero trust principles are very important to protecting against ransomware. So just shifting left a boom, meaning preventing as much as you can. Having robust zero trust controls can actually help you avoid that ransomware incident, which is what you would want to do. And moving left a boom, or shifting your prevention methodology, includes a robust information protection policy as well, because as we're seeing threat actors extract information and perform ransom from data that they extracted, you have to be able to hinder and block that data extraction. Credential phishing schemes are still on the rise. There are a number of cybercrime as a service offerings for people who are just selling access. So they're called access brokers. So they're just selling essentially compromised credentials so that other threat actors and adversaries can make use of them. And lastly, disrupting infrastructure here. Microsoft works in conjunction with a number of government entities and other different partnerships to disrupt malicious and adversaries and campaigns in the wild as well. So it's also reported how many of those have been done in the past year. Next, I'm going to look at devices and infrastructure. This is a quick overview of how global and how specific malware has targeted IoT and OT infrastructure. So there is a large number of Mirai and GAFGIT campaigns seen in the wild over this time, and there's and particularly for device infrastructure, attacks against remote management devices are on the rise, with more than 100 million attacks observed in May of 2022, 5 times more than in the past year. Attackers are increasingly leveraging vulnerabilities in IoT device firmware to infiltrate corporate networks and launch devastating attacks. This is why curbing and having full visibility of IoT devices and segmenting IoT networks is always important. So 32% of firmware images analyzed contain at least 10 known critical vulnerabilities. Microsoft has a number of vulnerability management capabilities that are looking deeply into firmware vulnerabilities, and they understand that having a look at that can curb a lot of OT and supply chain issues in your environment. Next, I'm going to be looking at cyber influence operations. So this is a section dedicated to analyzing how cyber has been utilized in geopolitical and population control and misinformation campaigns. Now, there's a large number of sightings in the report and reports within the report here mentioning how the essentially current war on Europe demonstrate cyber influence operations in many ways, including ways in which information that has been spread outwards of specific countries that targeted misinformation to people speaking that foreign language, English in this case, whilst that same nation was actually having different messages for their internal population in their native language. That's a very interesting finding in my perspective, right? So just the perception that or what they're propagating out to the world is a different of what they're saying internally, meaning they are amplifying essentially misinformation out in the world, whilst internally they are utilizing truthful or somewhat different information for their population. So that's quite interesting finding there. Now, other threat actors other countries have also employed propaganda against COVID-19 pandemic, and synthetic media here becoming more prevalent due to the proliferation of tools which easily create and disseminate highly realistic artificial images, videos, and audio. Digital provenance technology that certifies media asset origin holds promise to combat misuse, and that is a topic that is going to be fundamental with the rise of AI-generated content over the last few months, right? So it'll be interesting to see how the cybersecurity industry will combat this, right? AI-generated content. From my perspective, that'd be really interesting. And Microsoft is building on its already mature cyber threat intelligence infrastructure to combat cyber influence operations. So again, going back to a topic I mentioned before in the state of cybercrime, Microsoft is detecting and disrupting and actively working with governments and private industries to disrupt these threat actors and propaganda campaigns as well. So good, interesting information in there to report. And lastly, the last section that I want to cover is the overview of cyber resilience, right? So cybersecurity being this key enabler of technological success essentially requires of it that innovation and enhanced productivity can only be achieved with proper and robust security measures. So then what does it mean to be cyber resilient, or what are the good practices that Microsoft is recommending for good cyber resilience? I'm going to summarize everything that you see here. Essentially, password-based attacks remain main source of identity compromise, but other attacks are emerging. we are seeing basic security posture determining factor to advanced solution effectiveness as well. Now, when we think of basic security hygiene, I will take the time to just go to this particular page here, which this is the bell curve of the basic security hygiene. And according to the report, 98% of attacks can be protected by utilizing 5 principles and 5 tenets to your security. And these are it right here. Enabling MFA. So a very basic fact here. Applying zero trust principles, which in itself is a very broad recommendation, but if you start applying and if you start looking at all your different networked environment and different domains in your network and applying zero trust principles to all of them, you are going to be naturally minimizing your attack surface in many ways. Use modern anti-malware, and this essentially is a recommendation to use endpoint protection platform. Use a platform with EDR, endpoint detection and response. Make sure that you provide your threat hunting teams an assume breach, and you have those tools that allow your security operations center to threat hunt effectively. Always, again, assuming breach, and looking back to your zero trust principles again. Keeping up to date, naturally, one of the fundamental recommendations there for everyone. And lastly, protecting data, right? So protecting data is provide yourself with effective information protection controls. So this was a very quick look at 4 of the 5 very different sections of the Microsoft Digital Defense Report 2022. And I highly recommend you have a thorough look at the full document, which I'll leave a link in the description. Hopefully that's been informative for you. See you next time.